Okay. Well, let's see. Well, I'm here with Arianna Scott today. She's taking a course in peace psychology, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. We just finished a few weeks of study under the heading of Psychology of Nonviolence. So, Arianna, I want to just ask you how that came across to you, and what were the some of the significant things you learned from that?
It came across me. It was really interesting to me because you always hear so much like the psychology of violence, like the exact opposite of nonviolence. And I've done like a lot of like learning about that in previous courses, especially my criminal justice courses. But then during this module, it was like a completely like 180 take on it, and I found it really interesting. And I thought that the piece on like religion, which because we learned so much about Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. King's work, I thought that the religion piece of it was really cool. I also thought like the skill set that you have to adopt while
Yeah,
practicing nonviolence was really interesting, just because the skills are so transferable to all life aspects.
yeah, yeah. I take sort of a skills-based approach to teaching nonviolence because I think there are a lot of things that are useful in everyday life, and that they don't just belong in that realm way up at the level of international peacemaking and peaceful revolutions like Gandhi's and stuff. Um, and it's a very legitimate question to just ask anybody who studies nonviolence, which is, do the same principles apply from that high international level all the way down to the personal and interpersonal conflicts that we have every day?
I definitely think it does because even at that high of a level, if you're worried about like world peacemaking, there's still individuals making those decisions. So I think it does come down to like the interpersonal relationships between people because those are still the people making the shots all the way up there.
Yeah, and now, from the work of people who really study history down at the nitty-gritty, nuts and bolts level, they've often found that wars have started because of interpersonal emotions and anxieties and anger. Um, there's a story I heard that Russia was involved in Afghanistan for a long time before the United States was. And it was a disaster for Russia. They eventually had to withdraw, and they just couldn't do anything with um, the warlords and their armies there. But the whole thing started apparently because the leader of Russia was drunk one night, and he was angry and upset that a friend of his had been killed in Afghanistan, and he ordered his military to invade the country. So it was like this state of anger on the part of one person that led to a decision that resulted in a war that lasted 10 years or something for them. Um, and the fact that that can happen really makes me sit back and think about, wow, we have these emotions that we're sometimes not very good at handling. But if we also have great power, we can cause big things to happen. And in that case, a lot of collateral damage, a lot of direct damage, a lot of military hardware used up, and it's really striking.
Yeah, that's like well, that kind of like that's like reaffirms like my take on it, where I think why I think the psychology of violence has like the same effect on like an interpersonal level to like the world peace level, because like that's just like when we learned about the in World War I, the German ruler, like he just
Yeah,
wanted respect and power, and he didn't really want to get into a war, but because he wasn't able to get that, that's pretty much why World War I kept
yeah,
going and got started.
yeah. We read that piece by Barbara Tuchman about how the war started, and it was it, it, it was one of those pieces that comes across to me as being very psychological
Yeah,
because events are turning on the perceptions and the motivations and the knowledge and the decisions of individual people, sometimes for reasons that are not very rational.
yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So, yeah. So, we talked about that. We started that module on nonviolence by talking about the causes of nonviolence, which is kind of a funny title for a chapter, but and then the effects of nonviolence, and that was parallel to an earlier section in the course where we talked about the causes of violence and the effects of violence. I think the author was trying to create a parallel structure there. But how good a job do you think that author, Rachel McNair, how good a job did she do about opening up the topic for you?
I think she did a really good job. I mean, I definitely think that the supporting documents that you provided, like the side readings, definitely helped like put things into context. But I think
Yeah,
she did do a really good job about that because everything she was explaining about like the effects of violence and stuff, like we had just talked about, like we're talking about how disrespect that comes or like childhood abuse and stuff like that can lead to violence. And then when it talks about the causes of nonviolence, like she's kind of reiterating herself. So that
yeah,
way, because I, mean, I believe that like if you really need to learn something, you can't just like learn it once. Like you need to hear like the repetition of it. So I
yeah,
think that was good because you're hearing it in chapter one, and then like you're kind of forgetting about it when you're like moving into the next module, and then she like refreshes it all again, and it like really
yeah,
set in stone.
yeah. One of her concepts that repeated like that was the idea of perpetration-induced traumatic stress, the
Oh yeah, I
PITS
remember that.
idea, which and she defines that as a form of PTSD that is especially severe because it's driven by sort of the guilt and the trauma of having killed somebody. And then when she starts talking about nonviolence, she talks about different professions in which you may see a version of that syndrome, perpetration-induced traumatic stress. She talks about executioners and she talks about people who work in slaughterhouses and things like that. And then the question turns to what are their stories? What do they say about their experience? And how could we prevent some of the behavioral health aspects of this kind of trauma? Um, and I think that topic is her own research topic. I mean, she's the one that's known for raising up this idea of pits.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting because I never heard of that. Like I've known a lot about PTSD, especially like the
Yeah,
military and everything,
yeah,
but I didn't know that PITS like had its own name or label, which would make sense as you said. Like I think it is
yeah,
her own research. I think I remember reading that. Um, but it was also really interesting when she like mentioned the people, like the professions that would take place, like the people that would be experiencing it, considering like obviously slaughterhouse jobs and stuff like that, unless you're vegan or like expect like
yeah,
no animal torture, like certain things like that, you can't really help. But in most jobs, like especially like the military, there is a lot of other like solutions to problems and killing people, which
yeah,
is why usually that is like the last resort. Like that's not what they're trying to do.
yeah. I agree with you, and I think people often don't give the military enough credit for being really smart about these issues. Um,
They've definitely
but
gotten a lot smarter.
yeah, well, I think especially in the United States and Canada, the military is very sophisticated, and you know, officers and even down into the enlisted ranks, they're expected to take responsibility for making good decisions, and they're not treated just as robots. And that's very 21st century. Um, One of my friends says, you get a lot of insight into the world if you realize that most of it is still in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, and
Um,
I remember a point you brought up. I think it was your book. I don't think it was McNair's book. Was it agentic state? I don't know how to pronounce that. That
Agentic, yeah,
agentic, like the
yeah,
agentic state that like Hitler, for example, used to like turn the Nazis because they were like putting all of their like responsibility of their actions onto the person in charge rather than taking accountability for them themselves.
yeah,
I think that you definitely see a lot less of that nowadays in like the
mhm,
military, just
yeah,
because the people, even at the lower listening level, are definitely held accountable like for their own actions.
right. I think that was McNair's discussion on the agentic state. But yeah, it's a really fascinating moral issue, a philosophical issue. Um, I don't know if you've read anything by Hannah Arendt, but she was a journalist who studied what happened during the Nazi times in Europe, and in particular when the Israeli um, uh, agents, I guess, captured Adolf Eichmann in South America and brought him back for trial in Jerusalem. She went and covered that as a journalist and then wrote a famous book about it. Um, and she she pointed out things that I hadn't known that helped me to understand this agentic state issue more
Yeah.
fully. Because Eichmann's defense was that he was only following orders, and yet he was a high-ranking Nazi official, and he was in charge of collecting people in deportation camps. And a lot of the people who are rounded up and placed in these camps thought that they were just going to be deported to Palestine or to some other country. But in fact, it was just a step toward the concentration camps where they were all going to be killed. And people were in the dark about that. And one of the reasons they went along with it is that they just thought they were being deported. But Eichmann was in charge of that whole system of camps and the transportation of people to those camps. And the cover story, which wasn't true, about how this was a deportation program. And he had to lie every day, and he has to send people to their deaths every day. So the
Yeah,
court,
I haven't read about that. I actually didn't really know about that in general,
yeah,
but it is really interesting. And that kind of goes, I mean, I'm sure he experienced like the pits thing that we were just talking about after the fact.
it's not clear. I mean, some people's defenses are so strong that maybe they don't, and a lot of people who are involved in violent games and stuff for entertainment, they will claim, and I claim this myself, because I like violent movies once in a while. Um, but the claim is that we compartmentalize that stuff and that it doesn't affect our main life. And I think to a large extent that's probably true, but it can't be totally true because
Yeah.
we also know about things like observational learning in social psychology, where a lot of the things we learn how to do are things that we've watched either in real life or in media, and the probability that we will act out something that we've been um, excited to watch, it increases the tendency that the behavior will actually occur. Um, so there's a whole complex of issues there that are psychologically really interesting.
Yeah, I haven't heard about that, but I mean, I know about the compartmentalization. I
Yeah,
always miss that word. But I mean, I definitely am interested about that part of psychology because you see that all the time, not just with like violence, but like with trauma and stuff like that, and people separating like their work and like their family life.
right.
And I think that's like a defense mechanism that people use every day.
I think, yes, that's a good way to think about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and people use lots of defense mechanisms to sort of protect themselves or to answer criticisms of what they're doing. Um,
Yeah.
that's one of the good things that came down to us from the time of Sigmund Freud. It's one of his better contributions. But the the secret that most people still don't know about that is that a lot of the work he did on the defense mechanisms was actually done by his daughter, Anna Freud, who was also a psychoanalyst. And I really think the defense mechanisms are her contribution. But when we talk about denial and projection and reaction formation and stuff like that, that's basically their work. Um, and I think particularly it's Anna Freud's work. And those are still clinically useful concepts for understanding why people are saying the things that they do. Um, if somebody is arrested and they say, I wasn't there, I didn't do it, that's denial. And then the job of the other side in the legal system is to provide evidence to say, well, you can't deny it because here's evidence that you did. And it's a reasoning process. And I think, your career direction is toward that kind of investigative uh, work in the field of intelligence. And so you're going to be facing that kind of reasoning all the time. But the thing, as a psychologist, the thing to me that's most striking is that a lot of that reasoning hinges on irrational things that we do. And the defense mechanisms are sort of an irrational, uh, logically, they're irrational. Psychologically, they make a lot of sense. The person's trying to protect themselves. And this is
Yeah, I do because we learned about that too in this past module about like the personal logic. Like to be able to understand like your violent opponents, you need to be able to understand like their personal logic that they used to
right.
rationalize their violent actions in the first place.
Yeah,
And I definitely do think that's really important because if you
it
understand
is.
where someone's coming from, you can pretty much mitigate all further, I guess, violent like ways. Like
Yeah,
anything that's further in the dispute, I think that you can pretty much mitigate if you understand where they're coming from because you can
right.
understand where to start the problem.
Right. And you may get insights into how to interrupt the violent behavior because you understand the motivations.
Yeah.
Um, One of the things, as I've worked with this material now for a few years, something that really strikes me as important for both violence and nonviolence is James Gilligan's work on how uh, the being humiliated is often the start of a violent kind of motivation. People don't like being disrespected, and often violence is a way of trying to get respect back. It's a way of making your mark, usually at the expense of the person who hurt you in the first place. But the role of being disrespected in starting off that violent chain strikes me as a very important insight that psychology has not really dealt with much until Gilligan came along. And strangely, Gilligan is a psychiatrist. He's not a psychologist. But in some of his work, he almost starts to sound like Martin Luther King because he says, how do we stop violence? He says, well, if disrespect causes violence, maybe respect can turn it off and start behavior going in another direction. And
Yeah.
that's Gilligan drawing that conclusion from his own work, but it's also Martin Luther King. They're basically saying the same thing. And
Yeah, I just pulled up when while you were talking about it, I pulled up the first reflection that we did where like Gilligan's work was analyzed. And I
Yeah.
definitely do think that the respect the respect people get is, or the lack thereof, is like one of the most important aspects in like creating violence or what can lead to violence. And I think that it's important, like he had mentioned, like brings stuff back to like the early like stages of life when like during childhood is like
Mm.
implementing that understanding in your children that they deserve to be respected and that everyone else does too, which kind of goes with Gandhi's like beliefs on Hihisma, like everyone should be loved and respected no matter what, just because they're human beings. And just
Yeah.
because somebody else is disrespecting you doesn't
Yeah.
mean that you need to act out in the same way.
Right. And, being respectful is not just something nice that you do. It's very practical because it has heads off certain kinds of trouble, and it also lays a groundwork for being cooperative with other people. Um, so, as I said, my approach to all of this material is sort of skills based, and I hope it's seen as being, very practical. But what I'm always sort of fighting against is this misconception that nonviolence is just, idealistic and it doesn't have anything to do with practical everyday issues. And my sense is that it has everything to do with the
I agree.
problems that we face and the things that we don't handle very well.
I definitely agree with that because like the skill set that you need like to practice nonviolence, like with stress reduction, forgiveness, like having respect for everyone else, that I think that's like the bare minimum for being able to operate in society effectively.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I definitely agree with that.
yeah,
And yeah, no, I definitely think it is a practical skill set. I don't think it's idealistic at all. I think that it says a lot about somebody's emotional intelligence if
yeah,
they're able to act in that
yeah.
way, which is
That's a
really
good
important.
connection. Yeah. Yeah, that idea of emotional intelligence is a very good one. Um, it's sort of been hyped a lot into pop psychology, but it's a very good idea. And this uh, this this idea it's well supported in the literature. Let's say that. Um, but I'm kind of surprised that it doesn't have a more prominent place in the messaging that psychology does about its work, because I think this is one of the most important things people can learn about how to have a more satisfying life, how to be more effective with other people, how to solve problems nonviolently.
Definitely. And I have noticed, like, just amongst, I'm somebody who, like, the emotional intelligence thing really interests me. And I think about it all the time. I'll apply it to, like, my own personal arguments with, like, family, friends, etc. And
Yeah,
I definitely think that, like, my parents' generation, so they're in their 50s, 60s. I think during, like, that like, period of time, there was a lot less teaching about emotional intelligence or like nonviolence practices and stuff like that. And I think you can definitely see it now with like that age of generation because this like upcoming generation, which obviously has its own flaws, but they definitely are more in tune with wanting that emotional intelligence and holding people accountable for their actions and
yeah,
practicing, I guess, the skill set that you'd find in nonviolence. And I think that because then I've seen like so much like calling out, I guess you can say, of like our parents' generation and
yeah,
like having to have them unlearn things that
yeah,
they never even realized was wrong in the first place. So
yeah.
I do think our generation's like doing a pretty good job of that.
That's a really good perspective, and I really hope you're right, because I see some of those problems with my own generation. I'm in my 70s, but also with those, 50-ish, 60-ish people. Um, and I think in our culture, psychology may be partly responsible for uh, views of human nature that are not really very good. Psychology had a very long time where it was treating behavior as if there was nothing behind it. There was just not. There was uh, the behaviorist movement sort of didn't want to talk about the mind, It didn't want to talk about emotions like how you feel when you've been disrespected. Um, and so it was trying to account for aggression and violence it, purely in terms of environmental variables and situational variables. And certainly those are important. But I think you at some point you've got to get down to that level where James Gilligan is talking about how it feels to be abused and what it makes you want to do to get back at people and to restore your respect. If we don't understand violence at that level, I think there's a lot we're going to miss. Um,
I I actually was just learning about in the other online class I'm taking, which is history and stems of psychology, and we had just gone over like Descartes and Locke's ideas, right? About like innate versus derived ideas
yeah,
and empiricism. I think I'm saying that right. I think like that's what Locke is. He like believes that pretty much like your mind's ideas come from experiences. They're
right,
not so they're all like derived. Like he doesn't really believe in innate ideas like Descartes does. And although I definitely do think that like evolutionary and like biologically there are some innate ideas, I think that most of our ideas like in our mind come like from our experiences, and which
yeah,
would like goes hand in hand with like the abuse, like if a child like
yeah,
receives that when they're younger.
yeah, yeah. I think whatever we acquire before we start having experience, biologically, it has to interact in fascinating ways with our the things that we learn by seeing and observing and having experiences of being successful or unsuccessful. But I think that a really good model for how nature and nurture are sort of are going to interact with each other. It comes from Chomsky's idea that in for our languages, the languages that we speak, the brain is sort of prepared to learn a language when we're born. It's not just a blank slate, like John Locke might have said. Um, the Chomsky says, well, the empiricists have a lot to say, but they're wrong about language. And he made a very persuasive argument against the behaviorists by saying you are born with a human special ability to learn a language. And a young infant is listening to the language that surrounds him or her, and they're absorbing it like a sponge. There's and the first few years of life are so devoted to language learning that I think one estimate is, for a child between the ages of 2 and 3, they're acquiring about 50 words every day. And it's astonishing. It's just, amazing learning process. And Chomsky's argument is you're not going to just learn that by trial and error, because a human lifetime is not long enough to learn such long, complicated things. The brain must be prepared to do this. And it's something that we evolved to be able to do. And I think that maybe the brain is something like that for other things as well. Um, Unfortunately, I think the brain is prepared in a kind of unfortunate pattern when it comes to violence, uh, because our first instinct when we're threatened or when we're insulted or abused is kind of to lash back if we can, or to fall into this fight or flight state of the nervous system where we're not really thinking optimally about what would be the best solution. We're thinking about striking back or running away or maybe freezing. And no no other options. So that also to me is very psychologically interesting, and um, um, it's a puzzle, and I hope we're trying to unravel partly by
Yeah.
using that this interesting agreement between Gilligan, who studies violence, and King, who promotes nonviolence, and to discover at some level that they're really talking about the same kind of psychology. I find that fascinating.
Yeah, I do find that really interesting. I mean, I definitely like agree, like believe that people are born with like certain survival instincts that like go hand like with the fight or flight thing in your nervous system. But I think that would taking on Gilligan and King's perspectives on things, I would think it comes down to like the parents' responsibility, like our future generation, our like responsibility to teach your children the things that King is explaining and like
Yeah,
the principles that you can learn from reading about Gandhi and stuff like
yeah.
that.
Um, I hope that that kind of nonviolence education can grow. And
Well, because I
I
like, sorry, continue.
no, no, I think I have the same hopes that you do.
Because like, if I mean, I don't remember exactly, you know, like what I learned like during elementary school, middle school, but I do like I read like a couple things by Gandhi, but it was never the same thing with King. Like I heard about King and like what his like big goal was, but I never like read any like actual work by him in school
Yeah, yeah.
and or Gandhi. And I think that like would be really important for people.
I agree. And it's striking because most of the students that I talk to, and I've talked to thousands of students now over the last 20 years, um, they've never been given anything by Martin Luther King to read,
Yeah.
except for maybe the Dream speech from 1963 and the letter from Birmingham jail, also same year. Um, but those are very, very few students. They're usually students who are preparing a speech for a commencement or something like that. It's not everybody.
Yeah.
And I think that's really unfortunate. I think we've really missed something there in our education since Dr. King was assassinated. Um, we didn't pick up that ball and run with it in the schools. Um, and if we had, I think we'd have different conversations these days about a lot of the issues that we're worried about.
Definitely, especially because even if I know a lot of people have certain like stereotypes when it comes to like non-violence or like the word non-violence, but like if you break it down, like look at the skill set, like stress reduction, forgiveness, like
Yeah,
higher feel like levels of like self-efficacy, those are all things that schools and families are trying to instill in their children anyways.
yeah,
So even if you take the word nonviolence out of it and you're still giving them these readings and just saying, oh, we're teaching stress reduction, like in our elementary schools and stuff like that, and like breaking it down in middle school, I guess, because you wouldn't be reading Gandhi in elementary school, but like
yeah,
even if you didn't advertise it in a nonviolence way, I still think there'd be really easy ways to incorporate that in learnings.
yeah,
And like for instance, like I went to private school in elementary school and middle school, and all the religious roots that are like in nonviolence, I'm surprised they didn't take that on
yeah.
and like teach that more because like, there's so many opportunities to do that.
I think it's a little threatening to some school leaders and principals and stuff, because if you think about it, if you teach the history of nonviolence, you're going to be teaching students how to rebel successfully. You know, civil disobedience and stuff like that. It, they're really techniques not for the people who are powerful, but for the people who are not powerful. It's a way that they can get their needs met, even though they don't have all the weapons and all of the economic power.
I don't think though, like personally, I don't understand why schools or like organizations would like be having that take on it because their students are gonna probably lash like every school has kids that lash out anyways. So if you're teaching them those ways, would you rather have students who are understanding civil disobedience or like being violent?
Yeah,
Like you're having elementary school kids practice drills for school shooters.
Yeah,
Like, I mean, they're already introduced to violence.
yeah,
So introducing non-violence, I feel like should be easy. It shouldn't be something that like is a threatening topic.
yeah. Well, I think I certainly agree that if they got into it, they would quickly find that it's not threatening, it's empowering because it's building skills that are really relevant for the problems that people face. And so, yeah, I wish we would do it differently.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, well, thanks for your time, Arianna. This has been very enjoyable for me, and
Thanks for having me.
I and good luck. I know you're off to Korea soon, and
Sometimes.
you've got a lot of work to do with your National Guard duties, and um, I wish you well. I hope the our course contributes to your skill set.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to the rest of it.
Great. I'll see you soon.
All right, bye.